certainly bring many benefits to the church, as well as inevitable turmoil. But in the few minutes left, I would like to leave you, not with my own opinion, but with a set of principles or questions to keep in mind as you consider for yourself this issue of such great significance to the future of Catholicism. I have 5 principles or points. First, there is no doctrinal obstacle to the ordination of married, non-celibate men to the Catholic priesthood. In other words, the requirement is a matter of church discipline and not church doctrine. The Second Vatican Council, in its decree on the ministry and life of priests, Presbyterorum Ordinis, explicitly stated that perpetual continence, I quote, is not demanded of the priesthood by its nature, end quote. This is clear, the Council declared, both from the practice of the primitive church, and they cite actually the passage from 1 Timothy that I cited earlier, and from the tradition of the Eastern churches. In fact, the bishops at Vatican II explicitly noted that there were many excellent priests in the Eastern churches, and that the Council had no intention of changing their lawful practice, that is, the Eastern practice. Second, it is clear that the reasons formerly given, that is back in the 4th century, for the requirement are no longer the reasons that are given today. Particularly, the argument based on ritual purity, which regarded sexual relations as defiling, is, thankfully, no longer part of the Catholic rationale for the discipline of priestly celibacy. In fact, the Second Vatican Council emphasized that celibacy was appropriate to the priesthood because the priest was to be completely dedicated to the service of humanity in Christ. As Presbyterorum Ordinis stated, I quote, they, that is celibate priests, more readily cling to him, that is Christ, with undivided heart, and dedicate themselves more freely in him and through him to the service of humanity. They are less encumbered in their service of his kingdom and of the task of heavenly regeneration. End quote. In other words, nowadays, the argument for clerical celibacy hinges more on the benefits of celibacy than on the defects of marriage. Third, since the Second Vatican Council, especially in the teaching of Pope John Paul II, there has been a greater emphasis placed on the idea that the priest stands in the place of Christ. In persona Christi is the technical language that you see a lot in documents nowadays. That is, the rationale both for priesthood and for celibacy is found in the notion that the priest is an image of Christ, the supreme high priest. The notion of Christ also as the bridegroom of the church is invoked as the theological link between celibacy and priesthood. For example, Pope John Paul II, in a 1992 document, Pastores Dabo Vobis, I will give you priests, wrote this, I quote, the church, as the spouse of Jesus Christ, wishes to be loved by the priest in the total and exclusive manner in which Jesus Christ, her head and spouse, loved her. Priestly celibacy, then, is the gift of self in and with Christ to his church, and expresses the priest's service to the church in and with the Lord. End quote. Fourth, like most aspects of the church's thought and practice, the theology of priesthood itself is still undergoing evolution. As the Jesuit Avery Dulles, who's now Cardinal Dulles, noted in his recent book, The Priestly Office, A Theological Reflection, in the 16th century, the Council of Trent, when it defined priesthood, it placed almost exclusive emphasis on the role of the priest in consecrating the Eucharist as a sacrifice and on administering penance. And at Trent, it especially focused on points that Protestants had rejected. By contrast, Dulles points out, the Second Vatican Council developed a threefold understanding of the ministerial priesthood. Priesthood, according to Vatican II, is to involve three dimensions. One, a prophetic dimension, which is seen primarily as preaching and teaching the Word of God. Secondly, a priestly dimension per se, that is performing the functions associated with worship, especially the Eucharist. And third, a pastoral function, that is overseeing and administering the Christian community. Any attempt to rethink the celibacy requirement has to consider the impact of a married clergy, whether it's going to be positive or negative, on all three of these dimensions of the priesthood, not just on the sacrificial or ritual one. And finally, if the Church should move to ordain married men to the priesthood, it will be important, I think, for the Church to continue to foster the Christian vocation to celibacy, whether within the priesthood or outside of it. Celibacy, for the sake of the kingdom of God, has been a long and venerable tradition within Catholicism. It's been practiced by men and women, by lay and clergy alike. It is a witness, moreover, that most other Christian denominations do not preserve. Some people have argued that the law of priestly celibacy helps to keep this tradition alive. Other people argue that the specific gift or charism of celibacy gets obscured when it's not a gift but a law. I do not know exactly what the future holds on this matter, but I do know that there will always be a place within the Church for the gift of radical commitment, that is, the celibate life. Thank you. Lots of time for questions. Yeah, I better go to the mic.
I'm still confused about what the motivation is behind it. You said it started, or maybe predated the 4th century, that sex was considered impure. And I don't understand why sexuality would be an encumberment to a spiritual life. I'm still not quite...
Well, it is a very complex topic, and a lot of... I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a very complex topic, an awful lot of study has been done on the question. There's no simple answer. I'll give you just several possibilities, and these are not exclusive possibilities, but they all play a part. Okay, one thing is that in the ancient world, particularly in certain currents of, especially Greek philosophy, there's a strong bias against the physical, against the material. It's built into much of ancient philosophy, particularly in Platonic tradition. And many early Christian thinkers, especially somebody like this guy Origen in the 3rd century, bought into this notion that the spiritual, that there's a sort of antagonism in some ways between the spiritual world and the physical. Well, sexuality is so blatantly physical that many people felt instinctively that it was a sort of irrational animal side of the person, and that the more it was repressed or denied, the better. Okay? So there's that philosophical kind of element there. Also, and again, this is there right in the beginning of early Christianity, there's also a kind of tradition, and this may inform some of those radical sayings of Jesus, particularly the one about becoming eunuchs for the kingdom, and the notion that in the resurrection there will be no marriage, which are probably pretty legitimate sayings of Jesus. This comes from a sense that that celibacy represented the perfect life. Even if it was a physical life, it represented the perfect life of the angels, or of the resurrection. That is, as long as you're in the world, as long as you're producing children, it sort of ties you to life in the world, whereas celibacy is seen as a sort of foretaste in some ways of the future life of the resurrection. And so that's a big part of it. So you have these two traditions, and they're not entirely compatible, but they're both there in early Christianity. Then what you also have, and I think this is the case in the 3rd century, and then it really becomes the case in the 4th century, is that in the 3rd century, Christianity had spread very widely. And so it's there that you begin to see a sense that, well, there needs to be an elite. That is, most Christians are sort of, just average people. And so it's really in the 3rd century we start to get this idea that there needs to be an elite. There are some Christians who are really special, perfect, elite. And celibacy becomes a way of separating them out. Again, you find this in the 3rd century, partly because, as I said, Christianity is spreading. When you get to the 4th century, the Roman emperors become Christian. Now, everybody, or almost everybody, is a Christian. Even contemporary observers pointed out that, well, this may not be a very good thing for the church because, with everybody becoming Christian, the standards sort of go down. And so this tendency, which was already there, like I said, in the 3rd century, becomes even more pronounced in the 4th century. That is, the tendency to need to look to this elite group, those who usually they identify with the monastic life, those who reject possessions, those who reject sex, those who reject attachments to life in the world. So, like I said, it's a complex phenomenon. And the whole issue of clerical celibacy or priestly celibacy is just one part of the picture. Because a lot of the people who are adopting celibacy in the 3rd and 4th century are not priests at all. They're laity. And as I suggested earlier, I think that's one of the reasons why, in a sense, there's this pressure on the clergy to adopt celibacy, in a sense, to keep up with the laity, and maybe especially the women. Tom?
Well, I had a lot of Catholic education, and a lot of it's been concentrated on things you shouldn't do, sex and all these sorts of things, and it seemed to me that there's an over-concentration on this. Now, if you look back at the Gospels, it seems to me the mission, one of the important Christian messages there is to do unto others as you do unto yourself. You have the Good Samaritan stories. I don't find any stories in the Gospel about, again, sex at all. Do you? And my question is, did the Catholic Church, did they get off on the wrong rail here? And neglected, really, the central message of Christianity?
Oh, well, that's a big question. It does seem to be the case that sexuality came to bear, that is, the acceptance or rejection of it, particularly the rejection of it, came to bear an disproportionate a degree of the responsibility or the weight for defining holiness, really. I think that's the case. And why that happened, I think, is something scholars, historians of the ancient world and the medieval church still wonder about. Why that happened. Now there are certainly sayings of Jesus in the scriptures that do refer to sexual activity, or at least this sort of radical lifestyle of radical discipleship. Some of the things that I mentioned. But I think you're right in a real sense that in the Catholic tradition, the sexuality really became a problematic, an excessive preoccupation, I think would be a good way to put it. Maybe you should go up to the mic, please.
comment on any relationship that you see in your studies between sexual exclusivity and male exclusivity in the Catholic Church? There are some authors that maintain that once the sexual exclusivity of celibacy is eliminated, we'll see women as priests.
Well, that's an excellent question. I think, and I think this would be one of those benefits, possible benefits of loosening the requirement that I mentioned. I didn't specify what they were, but I think this would be one of the benefits, is that you would get a less you get a more representative perspective within the clergy, within preaching, within pastoral work. However, I don't think we should be naive and assume that just because you, let's say, start ordaining married men, that you're going to do away with sexism, or that suddenly, there's going to be this great change and openness towards women's, let's say, leadership in the or pastoral work in the church. I'm not convinced that would happen. I mean, there are the old boy network. I'm not talking about the clerical network, but I mean, in society, has been there for a long time without celibacy. But yes, I think it would help, and. I mean, to give a very specific instance, and I think this is what Jay Dolan was referring to in the quotation I started with, that certain decisions that the church has made, particularly on the sexual abuse matter, that is the tendency to cover up and move pedophile priests from parish to parish and so forth, it's hard to imagine that happening, at least to the same extent, if there had been married priests involved in the discussions, people whose own children were at risk. So, I mean, I do think it would be it would bring some healthiness of or broadness of perspective, and it would probably help some of the gender exclusivity. I mean, someone mentioned, I think to us recently, that, it was Father Fahey who was here a few weeks ago, and he said, the big change will happen when you start to have married men in the seminary, because they'll be living there with their wives, and it's their wives who will be having the impact on the clergy. And if I can see this, if I were to seek ordination, my colleagues would have to deal with with my wife here, and that would be a good. What's that? Not a pretty sight. She said. I think she's a pretty sight. Yeah.
Would you comment on the current practice of Episcopalian priests who convert to Catholicism, married Episcopalian priests converting to Catholicism? They're allowed to become ordained as Catholic priests after they convert?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, that's just one of actually many examples of ways in which there are already married priests in the Catholic tradition. And one thing I didn't refer to, but there are numerous married priests in the Eastern Catholic churches that are in communion with Rome. There was a history professor at Notre Dame in the Greek Catholic Melkite Rite, married man who was the priest of that parish. However, I mean, I think your question is very much related to this one, because sometimes it's the case that people have come from Episcopalianism into Catholicism, into Roman Catholicism, precisely to leave a church that has women priests. And so, again, sexual exclusiveness or inclusiveness doesn't necessarily lead to gender inclusiveness. Florence? Oh.
From the 4th century to the 11th century, was there any writing about the contradiction, really, between the sacramentality of marriage, including sex, and the fact that you asked married priests to abstain from their husband duty, or to really make the marriage of their life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to say, I'm not as familiar with with that period, with the period from the 5th century to the 12th century, as I am with the earlier period. The question was, in the period from the 4th century to the 12th century, was there discussion among Christians about the contradiction between the permanence and sacramentality of marriage on the one hand, and the separation of the married priests from their wives? Well, what there is there's considerable legislation dealing with what to do with the wives, and there's different viewpoints. I mean, you have some people saying that priests should not leave their wives; they have to be celibate, but they're not to abandon their wives. At some points, you have that in the legislation. At other points, you have a requirement that there be a physical separation, that they not live in the same house, that the woman enter into a convent. You also have legislation requiring that the wife agree that it can't be a unilateral decision. So I mean, you have that kind of thing in the legislation. In terms of the real question, though, I think you were asking was the theological issue of the sacramentality of marriage. And one of the things about the sacramentality of marriage, if we take somebody like Augustine, and it's his understanding of the sacramentality of marriage that becomes the Western view. What sacramentality meant was permanence, and the sacrament remained permanent. The bond was there, even if you were no longer living together and having sex. And in fact, Augustine's view, and this is still the Catholic view, that this is why divorce and remarriage is not allowed, because the second marriage is not recognized as a valid marriage, because the first one is still in place. And so the thinking would be that there wouldn't be a contradiction. That is, you could be a married priest. You could have separated from your wife, and usually this would have happened when people were older, after they had children, but the bond of the sacrament would have continued, would have remained. They simply would not have been sexually active. And so on the theological level, with that understanding of sacramentality of marriage, there wasn't a contradiction. Is that clear? Yeah, I mean, it's whether that's an adequate notion of sacramentality is another issue.
What's the experience of the Orthodox Church? Are they wishing they had celibate priests now instead of married priests? I mean, have they been satisfied with their clergy?
Yes, I mean, in general terms, I think it's clear that this is the custom that has been in place and the regulation that has been in place for ages. And from what I can tell, again, I'm not, since I'm not Orthodox, I don't have the insider's viewpoint. But my sense is that married priests in the Eastern Church are completely well accepted. I don't know if there tends to be a sort of hierarchy, monks thinking they're better than the married priest, but and that's possible, but I don't know that. But certainly, it has not, from what I know, it has not caused any insurmountable problems.
That's a perfect example, actually, of why having married priests is not going to necessarily open the door to women. Because we've had in the Orthodox, I'm Orthodox, I was born Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox. We've had married priests for years, and you can find the altar doors shut pretty tightly against a woman coming even close to them in the Orthodox Church. So,
Yeah, actually, I should have thought of that in response to the other question. And there, I think we have cultural explanations. Yeah. Crystal?
Can you comment about the recent sex scandals and sort of how that has affected the mystique of the priesthood and the pressure from the laity now, like you said earlier, the 4th century, the pressure from the laity saying that celibacy was the ideal, and that helped make celibacy become more prominent for priests at that time. How maybe that might be happening in the opposite way now, that laity are commenting that this is not a mystique thing anymore, that we believe that marriage is real and more ideal than that, and that might be affecting the church now because it's destroying the mystique.
Yeah, actually, at one point, in one version of this, of the principles at the end, at one point there was a 6th one, and it was the 5th in the list, but there was going to be an extra one, and it was going to be about the theology of marriage, because I think there have been clearly as dramatic changes, maybe more dramatic changes in Catholic perspectives on marriage in the last, let's say, 100 years than on priesthood. And I think a condition for any change in the requirement is going to be an appreciation of the genuinely spiritual and religious vocation to marriage. And I think in many ways that has been neglected, not to mention all the sort of negative aspects of Catholic perspectives on sex. So I think one of the things that's going to happen is that, and this may eventually sort of connect with Pope John Paul II's emphasis on the priest as the spouse of the church. That's really been the dominant metaphor, and it seems to me that that those who want to push that metaphor tend to think that there is a necessary connection between priesthood and celibacy, even though the Vatican Council said there isn't. There's a lot of people who think there is. And I think what it's going to take is a further development of a theology of marriage and an appreciation of the notion that the self-giving that's involved in marriage may actually be a kind of appropriate symbol or sacrament for the priesthood rather than an impediment to it. David, the guy right behind you, and then you. Sorry.
Well, I appreciate you letting open-minded Methodists into this room tonight. And I hope, as members of the Catholic Church and many of my friends here, you as members will stand up and address the leadership of your church. I've got faith that you'll do that. Call for Vatican III right away. The question tonight, though, really seriously, the 11th century, the reason to reinforce the requirement was financial. Do you see that
Partly.
as a continuing interest today on the assets or liabilities of the Catholic tradition?
Well, not in the same way. I don't think. I mean, in the 11th century, the problem was that there was a genuine. The church had genuine difficulty maintaining any kind of control over the appointment of its own priests and bishops because these were controlled by laity, and it was tied up with the fact that churches were often established and endowed by secular rulers who wanted to continue to control the appointments, and then, as I said, churches tended to be associated with the physical endowments, land, property, which then, when you had married priests, were passed on. So it's a different sort of thing. I don't see the
It's gonna be health insurance and housing
Oh.
and all those concerns.
yeah.
Houses and children of
Yeah.
ministers.
Well, it was that sort of thing that I referred to when I said, it's going to be, when it happens, if it happens, it's going to be, there's going to be inevitable disruption. And certainly the, I suppose that could be one aspect of it. But I suspect the main reasons, though, are more, are of a deeper nature than that. Somewhat theological and somewhat wanting to preserve, whether it's right or wrong, wanting to preserve the special sacred character of priesthood. And that's a serious issue. Scott?
Yeah. Well, perhaps instead of Vatican III, we could have Montreal I. They have much better hotels. Why is this such a hot topic in our culture, meaning the United States right now? And is it a hot topic for the rest of the Universal Church? And so, and maybe perhaps comment on the particulars of why it is a topic now, and perhaps comment on why we don't have more priests today. Why are less and less men coming forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, several questions there. And I'm sorry, David, you should jump up next too. Couple of things. The point you made again was something that I'd wanted to talk about, and that is the global context of this discussion. One of the things I read, an article I read in the last few weeks preparing for this, gave a very, very interesting example. I think it was a discussion that took place at Bishop Synod, I think it was 1971, where you had a bishop or cardinal from an African country saying it was absolutely essential that their bishops and their priests be married, that in that culture it was simply assumed that a leader was married. Okay? And then another bishop it was an Asian country where Buddhism was the dominant influence, and that person made exactly the opposite point, that in his culture it would simply be assumed that a leader or a priest would be unmarried. And so it seems to me that this is the kind of issue that is probably best left to regional episcopal conferences. That is, in certain cultures, in certain contexts, it's going to be appropriate, maybe even necessary, and in others it's not. And so I think it's one of those issues that's got to be dealt with that way. One of your other questions, why is there so much discussion now, but also why is there the decrease in priestly vocations? This is it's a fascinating question. One possibility is that particularly, and I should say this is a view that's especially held by those who want to continue the tradition of having celibate priests and excluding married people. The view is that since the Second Vatican Council, there's been a decline in the sense of the sacral character, of the special character the priesthood. That is, there was a time when it was considered a great honor to have a priest in your family, for a Catholic family, and that whole sense has sort of evaporated, disappeared in the last 20 or 30 years. So some people see that there's been a problem with this loss of a kind of sacred identity, or simply loss of identity altogether. And then sometimes this is correlated with with changes in the liturgy, with less kind of hierarchical and less sort of I guess hieratic, special sacred kind of experience at liturgy. That's possible, and maybe in some places that's a factor, but I guess I tend to see, and this may sound kind of heretical, but I tend to see the decline in vocations as a good thing in a certain way, because it is forcing the Catholic Church possibly to expand its understanding of what ministry is, to acknowledge that there are different kinds of people, married and maybe eventually women, who can serve in the church as prophets, priests, and pastors. And so, I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing that there has been this decline in priestly vocations. It's hard to tell what the ultimate outcome is going to be, but it seems to me one doesn't have to interpret it in a kind of negative way. Yeah, David.
The scandal over the bishop's handling of priests who abuse children has brought out the relationship between homosexuality and the priesthood, and a lot of it has been really ugly talk and prejudiced and sad. But I think there's been some talk that's helped me to understand, for example, the attractiveness in our culture where homosexuals are discriminated against and so forth. The attractiveness of the priesthood for gay men. And I just wondered if in your historical study this ever came up, or is this purely a 20th century thing, this interest in homosexuality, relationship between that and the priesthood?
That's historically, I guess I don't see it emerging as a question of, or that gets any kind of focus in the tradition. I mean, there certainly have always been gay men in the clergy, and I mean every now and then you find legislation about it, but I guess I haven't seen any discussion, and in the ancient or medieval sources, that treated any differently than anywhere else in society. I guess. Does that? I don't know if that is okay. Sean?
I think you should put in your sixth principle as theology of marriage. But I also think there's other issue that's under the bottom of it, and you've sort of hinted around it, is that the long tradition in discussions in theology of preserving the Greek dualistic spiritual-physical distinction, and that is really, in a sense, one of those things that makes it difficult to have basically a theology of marriage that includes sexuality in a very positive role, and that therefore that almost Gnostic stuff and other things that put the spiritual over the physical and don't see don't see, in a sense, the integration of that as being one of the problematics in terms of just the whole thing. And it's a big, larger question. It's just, it means a revamping of spirituality and of a whole notion of how do we relate, what we mean, in the Greek, when we use the Greek notion as opposed to a much more integral notion you might find in some other cultural discussions of the relationship of body and spirit, or body and soul, or whatever you want to use that.
Yeah.
But that's really, I think, one of the problems, I think.
Yeah,
Well-
let me break it down to you, what that means. It means that in my church a few weeks ago, it was preached to me in a Catholic church, unequivocally, that celibacy was better than marriage. This came from the pulpit. So that's what you're talking about, is that back and forth stuff, and it just seems kind of goofy, whether it's rooted in.
Well, it's still official teaching.
It is official teaching, is it? Is it?
Yeah,
I mean, after Vatican II, that celibacy is better than?
It's in one of the, I came across it in one of the Vatican II documents on the priesthood, not the one that I mentioned, Presbyterorum Ordinis, but there's another one on the training of priests, and it occurs in passing there. The idea of a kind of intrinsically superior way of life. Yeah.
Are you talking
So
about the document, the formation of priest?
yes, formation of priest.
Which would not hold the same weight
No,
in
this
terms
was
of official teaching as with the council document?
no, this is one of the council documents
Oh, okay.
that I'm referring to.
So it's at odds, son, still.
Well, it depends on what reason is given. I mean, it seems to me one can hold that celibacy is better, but it depends on what reason you give for holding that. But just another response on John's question. I think this issue about sexuality not being well integrated into spirituality is certainly a problem in the Christian tradition. Has been a problem for a long time. Maybe always, or just about always. It's a problem in other religions as well, in many other religious cultures. I had another comment on your point, but it escapes me at the moment.
I was just going to note something that came to mind as I'm listening. I think it's interesting, these sort of, what do I want to say here? The interesting crossroads that you find between celibacy and married life and sexuality, in that it's interesting that Christ was celibate basically for 33 years, what have you. However, in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, you find an extreme importance on reproduction and the sanctity of control of one's self and spirituality, but then not a negation of that, but again, another level of control once you're in marriage. So it's interesting, I guess, that a perception would be that celibacy is more important than marriage or sexuality, which in fact, if that was true, the world wouldn't exist as we know it today. I mean, it would have ended 1,700 years ago in the 4th century. Just a function of numbers, I guess. But what is the connection? You said that the church preaches now, or teaches now that celibacy is more important than marriage or sexuality. Is it actually?
Well, it's certainly not emphasized the way it used to be, but it's still on the books.
Not to point the finger, but my question is, and strictly a question, is it celibacy or is it a focus on sort of self-control or control of losing focus, as in shifting the focus from sexuality away from God, or is it actually the act of being celibate?
I think it's neither. It's the idea that in celibacy,